this webinar. We've done the last couple election cycles. Obviously, we had a huge election that just took place. Trying to kind of dig out, kind of figure out what that means. Obviously for the industry. ISSA does not take positions on elections or endorse candidates, but we obviously have to work with those who are in office, regardless of party. So that does sometimes change our policy priorities for the year or for the coming year. So we'll get into some of those. I'll also formally introduce someone, Jeff Hanscom, who's with the International Franchise Association, a little bit later. They've been a great partner with us on a number of different issues, and obviously, many of I know we have a lot of franchises who are members of our association as well. So we'll get into that. Just a couple housekeeping items. Obviously, generic disclaimer. We're going to try to ensure accuracy and reliability of the information. This is not legal advice. Obviously, take this back, but we do want to give you kind of a sense of what we see coming down the pipe, different things like that. Just a little background. My name's John Nothdurft, Director of Government Affairs for ISSA. Been with the association since 2019. Lead all of our advocacy, lobbying, and regulatory compliance issues for the association. Really excited to see the growth of what we've done for our membership. Just as kind of an FYI, kind of three key functions that we serve our members, all of you out there, is advocacy. So that's kind of where you guys are part of that, right? We try to help make sure that you are being good advocates for your business, and become an impactful advocate for clean. You are our best salespeople. I can go, or people like Jeff can go to Capitol Hill, talk with state policymakers. They get tired of hearing us. They want to hear from real businesses, real people in their own communities. So that's where you guys really come into place. So really encourage you. We'll have some opportunities for that throughout the year for you to get engaged on things that matter to you. Obviously, lobbying. Myself, I'm a registered lobbyist. We have a DC lobbyist as well, that engages government officials on your behalf, on behalf of the entire industry. So we do that proactively. And then obviously regulations and regulatory compliance, whether that's with labor regulations or chemical regulations. Misha Ragland, who joined our team earlier this year, really works a lot on the regulatory side of things. So if you ever have questions about various laws on the books, how can we comply with those? We are there to assist you on those types of things. Um, Obviously, without having an impact, there's that's a really important part of what we try to do. Here's just kind of a couple highlights of what we've been doing. International Cleaning Week, which I'll get into a little bit. We had 24 state governors last year proclaim, or this year proclaim Cleaning Week in the states, in addition to a number of cities. Our Clean Advocacy Summit, which I'll talk about, we did receive an award from EPA Safer Choice. And then this should be updated, our strengthened number. So we are now over 2,000 advocates for clean. So these are people within the cleaning industry who have said, hey, I want to be an advocate. You receive biweekly updates from us. And so we now have over 2,000 advocates who hopefully get engaged, reach out to their members of Congress, their state lawmakers. So we're really proud about that. I would say that's our superpower, right? Is the sheer size and scope of the industry. So I mentioned some of that, 2,000 Advocates for Clean. One of the big things that we did earlier this year, and actually IFA was really helpful in that, was we defeated a 2,000 square foot workloading cap bill. So in California, this is a bill that would have said, hey, a worker can only clean 2,000 square feet per hour. Obviously, for like a distribution house or a warehouse, that could be very difficult, right? You can clean a lot of square footage very quickly. So that was a huge success for us. I mentioned our work on International Cleaning Week, our summit, which is our yearly, every spring, we bring our members to DC to meet with their elected officials. We had 32 states represented and had over 133 meetings. So that's a big thing that we've done. I mentioned our expanded regulatory capabilities. And then lastly, Stacy Seiden launched our state advocacy leaders program. So identifying people, one or two leaders in every state to try to be our eyes and ears and kind of point people at the state level. We now, I think, have over 20 of those leaders. If you're interested, I'll send you later in this presentation a little bit of information about how you can do that. And then, as I mentioned, this is our big flying. I'm going to mention this ad nauseum. This is a really great experience. We've grown every year. Had over 120 business leaders in DC meeting with elected officials, representing small, residential cleaners all the way up to Fortune 100 cleaning manufacturers. So it's a really great event. We teach you how to have meetings. You're never alone. We put you with groups. It's great for networking. It's great to kind of just get a feel for what's going on in DC and the industry. And it's really your opportunity. As I often say, whether it's to our board or others, if you're not on the menu or if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And the cleaning industry has stepped up over the last couple of years to really take a leading voice in DC. Um, so with that, here's kind of some of the major issues we're going to talk about in addition to just kind of over, what happened with the election. We're not going to get too far into that. Obviously, we all kind of know, we all watch the news. We know kind of what happened there, but kind of what does that mean, right? What are the issues that are going to be relevant to the cleaning industry? And what are the ones that we're seeing that maybe we will have a little bit more of an impact on? So this is kind of a couple of the issues that we'll be touching on. We're not going to get super in depth, but want to give you a breath of some of the things that we see coming on the horizon. Both myself and Jeff, who they do a ton of work. IFA is a hugely impactful in DC. Top-notch lobbying government affairs team over there. But we did want to kind of ask everyone who's on here, what are the issues that you see that are impacting your business or that you think are the most important to you? So we have a couple on here. So I think you're able to choose a couple of them. So labor immigration, obviously huge issue. Inflation, taxes, supply chain tariffs, regulatory or other. If you have other, please put those in the chat. Would love to see what other issues are facing your business that maybe we're missing from here. Obviously, these are some of the big ones, but there's a lot out there. So I see a lot of broad, just kind of looking at it, a lot of varied different issues. So it's not like one issue is taking full amount. So we'll give that a couple more seconds. That'll give me the chance to introduce our next speaker, Jeff Hanscom. As I mentioned, Senior Vice President for State and Local Policy for the International Franchise Association. I'll let him kind of introduce the group, but obviously, like I said, they've been a great partner with us, dating back. Actually, their CEO, I remember working with them on issues during the pandemic on healthy and safe workplaces and trying to get tax credits for cleaning, and they were super important and helpful on that. And then, as I mentioned earlier this year, with the stuff going on in California and some other issues, they've been a great partner of us. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Jeff, and we'll close out. Well, first, let's close out the poll and see kind of where we are. I think she's sharing them. So, wow, so supply chain tariffs, 58%, but pretty broad spectrum on the others. So 40% labor, inflation. Obviously, I see some other ones in the chat. Yeah, so really kind of interested to see. I think that just shows the breadth of our membership and what's going on out there. So really appreciate you guys weighing in on that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff for a couple minutes.
Cool.
So
Thanks,
Jeff.
John. Good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate being with you. Afternoon from a very damp and dreary Washington, D.C. today. So as John mentioned, Jeff Hanscom, Senior Vice President, State and Local Government Relations at the International Franchise Association. We are fortunate enough to count some overlapping membership with with you great folks. Obviously, we have some brands that are in the franchise space, in the cleaning franchise space, I should say. So welcome to those folks and good to be with all of you. As John mentioned, I've been at IFA and have led our state and local government relations for a little over a decade now. So we typically engage in, as the name would imply, franchise issues, but slight caveat to that is that as you probably all well know, there are certainly franchise brands in the cleaning space, but there are also brands in the restaurant space, and the hotel space, and lawn care, and so on and so forth. We've got about 12 to 1,300 brands that we represent across about 300 different business verticals. So What that means is that without a staff of hundreds of people here, which unfortunately we do not have, we concentrate our focus on franchise business model issues. So that, in a nutshell, means anything that would impact a Jan Pro or a Jana King, and would also impact a McDonald's or a Marriott, right? So that's kind of the prism through which I view the world and through which I view advocacy and government relations work. But just some table setting here. And I will say one thing before I get into these bullets here. I will just echo what John mentioned about encouraging folks to attend your fly-in. We, like a lot of trade associations like ISSA, we also host a fly-in in DC. Ours happens to be typically in the September timeframe, but what I can tell you is that having done this job for a long time, whether it's here in DC or whether it's out in the States, lawmakers at all levels of government, federal, House and Senate down the road here, state legislators, state senators in California and Texas and Florida and everywhere beyond, the information that you all are able to give and the stories that you all are able to tell are so much more impactful than when John or I or someone like us are telling them on your behalfs, right? So the opportunity to get yourselves physically in front of lawmakers and to tell them your stories face to face is instrumentally helpful in doing what we do on the other 364 days a year. So anyway, just a plug for that. We make the same plugs to our members when we encourage them to come to Washington for our fly-in, or I encourage them to come to Sacramento or whatever other state capital for fly-ins that we host in across the country. But like I said, all I can tell you is that hearing the message directly from business owners, directly from constituents in their communities is so much more impactful than from myself or others. So with that, here we are. We got the 119th Congress coming up, and some of us may have been left scratching our heads a few weeks ago. Actually, geez, it's almost a month. It's over a month ago at this point. Hard to believe. And thinking, what in the heck just happened? And quite frankly, what happened is we've got pretty much a tectonic shift here in Washington, right? It's been a long time since you've had trifecta control. White House, House, Senate, all controlled by the Republican Party, or all will soon be controlled by the Republican Party coming up here in January. Obviously, the breakdowns that we've got right now, you've got 220 to 215 in the House, the Republican majority, and you've got 53-47 in the Senate, with some new folks in both of those camps, right? Now, the Republicans obviously have 220 in the House. It's still a pretty thin margin, considering they need almost all of those folks to stay, if you will, and vote in a block in order to get things done. The Senate, they've got a little more wiggle room at 53-47, but you need about 218 in the House to really move stuff. So you can't lose anybody. So there's a little bit of a notion, if you will, that, well, Trump won the presidency, Republicans control the House and the Senate, this is going to be great, right? We're going to get all those things done that we haven't gotten done in the last, number of years. Everything is going to get fixed. This is obviously all considering you're looking at this through that Republicans are better, if you will, for business than Democrats, which is not always true, given experiences that we've had. But it's easy to look at this and say, okay, we've got ours across the board. All of our business issues are going to get fixed. All of our tax issues are going to get fixed, right? Taxes are going to go down. Everyone's going to get more take home. I mean, all in all, right? And everyone's looking at it through, you can look at it through rose-colored glasses. And certainly looking at it from a glass half full perspective is generally more positive, generally more uplifting than the reverse. But with that said, with the numbers in the House being, again, Republicans control, but they don't have slam dunk kind of run whatever they want through type of numbers. So it's still a little bit of an unknown, right? And obviously you've got a president, a returning president who has always been a little bit of a wild card, right? You don't, if 4 years and the campaign has taught us anything, is that you don't always know what President Trump is going to do, right? Is he going to toe the whatever the standard kind of Republican line is, even if that line has become exceedingly blurred over the last few years? Is he not? Is he going to go off in a different direction, right? It's really hard to know. So all of that really is just to say that it isn't just because Republicans are going to control all three branches is not, or all three president, House, Senate, is not then make it a slam dunk that every bad policy is going to immediately get fixed and every tax is going to immediately get lowered and everything like that. Now, there are obviously better chances of those things happening, but none of them are guaranteed at this point. We can go ahead to the next slide, please. So here is really my neck of the woods, and by that I mean the whole country. I am fortunate enough to cover all 50 states and everything that isn't Washington for the IFA. And so really the biggest difference here is to see all those things that changed in Washington, right? New party controlling the White House. You've got a new majority in the Senate, things like that, right? And a pretty significant shift, across. But what the opposite is true at the state and local level, right? The most of the trifecta states, those that were all three controlled by Republicans. You've got the governor, and then you've got both houses in the state house. Both of those, or the numbers of states that are all blue versus all red versus purple, they've got a mixed government. Those didn't really change, right? So you've still got a good chunk, certainly more Republican trifectas than you've got Democratic trifectas, but you've still got some of both, right? Does that always mean that the Californias of the world are going to be more challenging than the Floridas of the world? Not always. Does it usually mean that? Yes, especially for the issues that we deal with at the IFA, more often than not. So the places that have been challenging, like California, like New York, places like that will probably remain challenging. The places that have been less challenging, at least again from my unique prism that we look through government relations from, a Texas or places like that, are they going to continue being potentially less challenging? One would hope so. But really, the story here is to see all those things that changed at the federal level. Really, not a whole lot changed at the state and local level in terms of who has and who maintains the balances of power, right? And I touched on it a second ago. Just because a state is red versus blue versus purple, at least for our issues, does not always mean up or down, yes or no, good or bad, right? We've had issues that are knockdown, drag out fights in places like Georgia and Arkansas. And then just last session, I was, patting Governor Newsom on the back for signing a bill in California that we push forward, right? So it can go both ways. It's not always as cut and dry as red versus blue, but essentially, like I said, the state landscape from a legislative perspective and a majority's perspective has actually remained pretty consistent from the last round of elections, as opposed to the federal government. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So this is just our policy, our top 5 policy priorities going into the new administration, right? So this is what IFA is going to be focused on here in DC. Most of these things are pretty nuanced. Some of them, not most. A number of them are nuanced into the franchise space, so may not be as impactful for those not in the franchise space. But certainly one of the biggest issues for everybody, if you're in the business world, is going to be taxes, right? And even if you're not in the business world, really, is going to be taxes, right? There are a lot of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA, provisions that date back to Trump 2 or 1.0 that are coming up for either they're going to be expiring next year. And so that is setting the stage for a pretty significant tax battle royale, if you want to call it that, here in Washington, on which ones of those extensions or which ones of those provisions are going to be made permanent, what's going to be extended, what will they ultimately not be able to come to an agreement on and will go by the wayside. All of those things will have impacts on businesses across the country, whether you're franchised or not franchised. Obviously, like I said, some of these issues, franchise independence, that touches a little bit on some of the issues that are tangentially around that, like independent contractor questions, joint employer questions, franchise disclosure. Again, that's unique to franchising. Tax code, we talked about that. We'll get a little bit more into that in a second. Main Street fairness is really, that's our fancy way of saying, talking about, ensuring that we roll back regulations or prevent further regulations of business that really hampers one's ability to become an entrepreneur or continue growing their business. I mean, you can think of this in the the Doge Elon Musk, if you will. I don't think we'll be that extreme, but certainly we're going to do what we can to try to ensure a smoother business climate, both here in Washington and out in the States. And then obviously number 5 is where I come into play, is trying to prevent the spread of bad policies here in DC. And we unfortunately deal with a bunch of those, as I'm sure you all do. And some of them we have overlap with, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. Go ahead, please. So the joint employer rule, right? This is joint employer for those who are not familiar with the term, is essentially the question of who is the employer of an employee. So for me, IFA is my employer. I am a W-2 employee of the International Franchise Association, right? For those of you in the franchise space, you are, I'm sure, overly familiar with the question of joint employment. For those of you not in the franchise space, but those who may use independent contractors or who may use third-party services in your businesses may understand the joint employer rule. But essentially, the question is, who is and who is not the employer of an employee, right? And the reason that matters, especially for us in the franchise space, is that we have 2 distinct entities. You've got the franchisor, the brands, and then you've got the franchisees, the individual owner operators of the stores themselves, right? In the franchise model, it's the franchisee who is the ultimate employer of the franchisee's employees, right? So the easiest example is you go into a fast food restaurant, the folks who are cooking the burgers, making the fries, running the cash register, those folks are employees of the individual franchise owner of that particular unit. They have no employment relationship with brand itself, right? But obviously, for a number of reasons, typically those coming out of organized labor and from the left side of the aisle, we've seen an erosion of the joint employer standard this began back in the Obama administration, and a little bit less so in the first Trump administration, then the pendulum swung back the other way during the current Biden administration, and it's kind of been going back and forth. Essentially, we've been dealing with joint employer for the better part of a decade now. And so we are going to be doing everything we can to put some finality to that discussion here with Trump 2.0 coming into town here in a month and a half or so. But obviously the brief history kind of in 3 bullet points here is the standard for joint employer was rewritten. It went from a standard of you had to have direct and immediate control over the working conditions of an employee to be considered a joint employer, to a standard that said you could have indirect or the potential to exert indirect control. What is indirect control? What is the potential to exert indirect control? Nobody really knew. Nobody still knows. But for us, from a franchise perspective, it was alarming in so much as, could one consider the requirement that employees wear certain uniforms, certain colors, perform certain tasks as indicia of indirect control, and thereby establish a joint employment relationship between franchisee employees, someone who's making a burger or making fries or whatever the case may be, and ultimately franchise brand. And that for us is a very, very big problem for a number of reasons that I won't get into, but essentially it makes a franchise not a franchise anymore, and that's bad for us. So we have been laser focused on joint employer issues for over a decade now. Most recently, in March of 2024, earlier this year, U.S. District Court struck down the Biden era rule. And so that really puts the standard back to the Trump rule, which is a good thing for us. And hopefully we're going to do everything we can to ensure that that's where the rule stays, and hopefully do some political maneuvering and policy maneuvering to enshrine that into a more permanent position as administrations do continue to change going forward. Go ahead, please. Okay, so here are some other of the issues that we, and I know ISSA, are looking at both here in Washington and then out across all the states, right? You've got the new joint employer discussion that's coming in. You've got DOL's updated overtime thresholds, which obviously have, kind of gone like this, depending on the administrations. You've got new independent contractor rules. We have dealt with independent contractor questions all across the country for years now, whether it's the ABC test, is it the 20-factor test, is it the IRS test, who's using what test. You obviously, if you're in California, which I saw a number of you are based on the chat responses, you I'm sure have heard about AB5 and the implementation of the strict ABC test in California. Massachusetts also has a strict ABC test. Obviously where the ABC test was contained in what's something called the PRO Act here in Washington, we, as the Franchise Association, pushed back pretty heavily and aggressively against an implementation of a strict ABC test. There are a number of reasons for that. Essentially, it boils down to there is an interpretation of an ABC test where the franchise relationship, that contractual relationship between a franchise brand, a franchisor, and a franchisee, could fail an ABC test, and then you would be left with, instead of joint employer, you'd be left with the same outcome, but you'd be left because the relationship failed an independent contractor test, right? So that's an issue that we've been remaining very vigilant on. Non-compete bans, right? So the FTC obviously banned the use of non-competes. That ban was, believe it was struck down via litigation pursued by the U.S. Chamber. We have not been as engaged in the non-compete space over time. There are, within the franchise model, we have contractual relationship, the franchise agreement that governs relationship between franchise brand and franchisee. Within those agreements, there are typically varying versions of non-compete language, and how franchisees can either, if they leave that agreement, can they go open a competing franchise? If they can they be franchisees for multiple brands? If so, can they sell two different, can they sell burgers under two names? Can they do? So there's a whole host of issues, but essentially we have backed away from the non-compete question, but for the abilities for franchise brands to ensure that franchisees can't take trade secrets or other information like that and then start a competing business. We also deal a little bit on the issue of it's related to non-competes, but essentially it would say that whether or not workers can move within a franchise system to different franchise establishments, right? So could you move from one Papa John's location to a different Papa John's location, but potentially those that are owned by different franchisees, and how does that work? But again, that's a very specific franchise kind of issue for us. Union elections, I'll let John talk about that one a little bit. We certainly pay attention to that, card check issues like that. And then state issues, right? Workloading limits. I know, again, that's something that John touched on a second ago. Harassment training, you see a lot of that in California right now. PTO requirements or pay time off requirements. Minimum wage laws. We deal a lot with minimum wage laws, but really in a sense of ensuring fair implementation of those laws. And what I mean by that is when I say we, I'm always talking about IFA. So just so you guys know, I'm not speaking for ISSA or anybody else, but when we look at minimum wage laws, we do not typically engage so much on it should be 18 versus 16 versus 22 or whatever the number is. We just say that, look, if you're going to have a minimum wage law, it's got to apply to everybody the same way, right? Big, small, medium, whatever the case may be. And you can't treat a franchise differently just because they're a franchise as opposed to not a franchise, right? A lot of that is obviously coming out of California. We've done a ton of work dating back to about the beginning of COVID, so dating back to early 2020 up till now, in and around labor issues in California, specifically centered on workforce boards and the quick service restaurant space. Minimum wage has obviously been a big part of that. But what we have also been seeing, and you can go ahead to the next slide. I think there's, so there's, and I'll talk just a little bit more about that in a second, but we've done a lot in the minimum wage space and a lot of issues that kind of come out of that. But the Trump tax cut extension, that is setting up to be, and as it says, one of the most lobbied bills in recent memory, right? When the TCJA was passed back in 2017, there were a number of provisions within that law that were good, that people saw tax reductions, right? So the three big ones for us, and then go ahead to the next slide. And so the three big ones that IFA is focused on at the federal level for the upcoming TCJA debate is making the 199A deduction for qualified business incomes permanent, restoring bonus depreciation for capital investments, and expanding the workplace opportunity tax credit. Now, again, how much crossover those have into tax issues that ISSA members are concerned about, I will leave to John and others to discuss, but these are the three big ones for the IFA. And the reason for those is that, actually, I won't take that back. I won't eat up too much more time here. But essentially, what it's going to come down to is that Republicans have razor thin majorities, especially in the House. They're going to need to keep virtually everybody on message and voting as a block in order to get things done, assuming they don't go through a reconciliation pass it direction. But it's not as slam dunk as we would hope, right? I mean, clearly, you look at the numbers and you're like, oh, they've got the majorities. Everybody votes one way. Good to go. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. It never is. And then, some of these TCJA debates are going to be huge, whether you're calling it the tax cliff, tax Super Bowl, hurt them all. It's gonna suck most of the oxygen out of the room, at least here in Washington, especially at the kickoff of the new year and the new administration here in about 6 or so weeks. On issues that virtually everyone in town, whether you're franchise association, whether you're a cleaning association, or anyone in between, is going to be up there talking to members about why it's important to them and why it's important to their members. So if anyone tells you that they know what's going to happen within the tax debate right now, they're probably blowing a little bit of smoke, because nobody does, and everybody is vying for the best position that we can. But the last thing I'll say is, at the state level, what we have been dealing with a lot of, and a lot of this comes out of issues in California, as for better or for worse, sometimes more often than not for worse, if it's coming out of California, at least for the issues that we care about, are what we call workplace standards boards. Now, some of you may have seen these, some of you may have seen coverage of these in the news. Obviously, California had a lot of conversation around creating a standards board, or what's now informally referred to as the Fast Food Council. And what that essentially boils down to is legislators or city council, or whoever the case may be, passing a law that delegates their authority to an unelected and somewhat unaccountable board. That board is then empowered with lawmaking authority to implement new laws and new rules for specific business models, business lines, right? So in California, you've got the Fast Food Council. As the name implies, that council could have been empowered to make any law it wanted to impact the fast food space, right? To any minimum wage. We did a ton of negotiations, a ton of work behind the scenes with governor and anyway, without getting into all the sausage making. Ultimately, we came out with a board that has advisory capacity. The minimum wage did go up in California, as I'm sure a lot of you have seen, for fast food workers, currently sitting at $20 an hour. That was kind of part of our give and take there. But coming out of that, we've been engaged in a workplace standards board issue in Minneapolis that we just worked for the better part of a year with a lot of allies on. The mayor ultimately vetoed that proposal, but we expect these types of issues to continue gaining traction, especially at the local level, and especially as you see the results here in Washington. A lot of proponents of these workplace standards boards are going to look at Washington and see a dead end for their issues, right? So what are they going to do? They're going to turn to places like California or Chicago or Detroit or Minneapolis or New York and try to go there. And you've already had California basically put a line in the sand and say they were going to be the home base for the war against the President Trump 2.0, right? So this type of stuff will continue to proliferate. At least we think it will continue to proliferate. Typically pushed, and proponents are typically organized labor, SEIU and those types. So that's probably the biggest issue at the state level that is more generally business as opposed to strictly franchise that we deal with. But I'll pause there, and I know I've sucked up a lot of the oxygen in the time. So if you have questions for me, feel free to put them in the chat, or I think my contact info is on a slide here or there, or get them to John, he can get them to me. But anyway, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you guys. And like I said, don't hesitate to ask any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And on those boards, I mean, he talked about the fast food one, but one of the things that we were talking about that 2,000 square foot. So that bill had actually, it started as a 2,000 square foot limit, which actually was a lot easier for us to actually kind of push back about. And then they actually changed it into a quasi sort of board that would have this sort of um, unadulterated regulatory authority that was like very vague and didn't know what that could end up. And luckily we were able to, with groups like IFA and BOMA and others, to actually get that to be a study committee or a study instead. So just because, like I said, a lot of these sort of things, they start in one area, maybe it's fast food or elsewhere, but don't think that the cleaning industry is not front and center for some of these sort of laws as well. The only thing I wanted to mention on the tax reform, I agree this is going to be a heavily lobbied bill. I would disagree with Jeff though, because I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to happen with the tech. No, I'm not, but it's going to be very interesting. You know, it's a holiday season. I joke it's going to be like a Christmas tree. I mean, you're going to see everything try to be thrown. We're going to see what side of ornaments actually hang on to this, and I don't think anyone really knows. And so that'll be a huge play, and there'll be stuff not related to tax reform in there as well. So that's going to be a huge effort between that and whether that's going to be part of a reconciliation package that includes immigration and border security or not. There's a lot of debate on Capitol Hill of what that's going to look like. But really, thanks, Jeff. And just a reminder, if you do have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I'm going to go through my slides pretty quickly because I do want to get to some of our questions because I do see quite a few in here. But just very, big picture, some of the issues that we are focusing on as your association. I saw one question in the chat about tariffs and supply chain. Trump's tariff policy are a huge wild card. He's used them obviously during his first term on Chinese goods primarily. Now he's starting to signal that he may use it on allies like Canada and Mexico, which is kind of interesting because during his first administration, we were very supportive of a lot of the free trade stuff that he did, like USMCA, which was a renegotiation of NAFTA. We are very supportive of that. Great to see free trade. We're members of Americans for Free Trade. But that's we're really kind of concerned about what that could look like. I mean, that they could have huge impacts. Um, and to kind of explain where ISSA comes from it, good example of this. We have one small company. I think they're actually on this webinar. I think I saw them and I pulled out one of their letters and they said based on, they manufacture and assemble cleaning equipment in the US, but they import a couple key components. And they said due to the tariffs that were imposed, they lost business and experienced a 9% reduction in workforce. So these have real impacts. These are American companies that are getting impacted. So, we are very advocate. We're definitely going to keep track of that. See what we can do. One of the reasons, people often ask why is he doing tariffs? Well, tariffs are one of the things that you can unilaterally do. You don't have to get congressional approval for yet. There are some bills in Congress trying to say, hey, we're going to seek some sort of oversight of tariffs, but it is one of the tools in the quiver of the president that he can roll out. So I think, quite frankly, he's using the tools at his disposal. I think it's not the greatest tool. I think it's having a huge impact on our industry. But that's continuing to happen, and we'll see kind of where that happens. Part of it, I think, is obviously negotiation. You're right; he's not the president, but he's already sitting down with like Justin Trudeau in Canada to try to get some some things in exchange for that. So will he actually move forward to that? No one really knows. Kind of on the, I know many of you are, we have a lot of manufacturers and distributors who are also in here. So obviously cleaning product regulations are going to be a huge, huge issue. During the Biden administration, there was a big effort to, repeal or try to get PFAS out as well as the state level. EPA Safer Choice, which is ISSA is a big supporter of. This is the eco label. During the first Trump administration, that agency was fairly defunded. We're hoping to maintain Safer Choice. We think it's a really good program. So that's something we will definitely be talking with policymakers to ensure that exists and is very good. And then obviously talking with lawmakers about registration of cleaning products, sanitizers, disinfectants. How can we streamline that process? How can we make sure that process is more streamlined and obviously so that's something I know we've been talking about with whether it's EPA, the administration, the incoming administration. That's going to be top and front and center as we kind of work through that. So I think that's one area that probably having this administration, I would imagine, would be more likely to impose some of those. They're already talking about how can we cut, how can we streamline. So I think that there's some benefits there, but obviously, like the Safer Choice program, that could be something that we're concerned about. Sustainability and extended producer responsibility. So this is mainly probably going to be a state issue moving forward, but it's a huge issue that I wanted to put on here. ISSA's big supporter of sustainability, trying to lead by example, but producer responsibility is basically the end of life. Think recycling, for lack of a better term. And in the realm of the cleaning industry, it's putting the onus on manufacturers, brand owners, and distributors of those products to be accountable for the entire life cycle of the packaging. A number of states listed here, California, Colorado, Maine, Minnesota, Oregon, have enacted EPR packaging laws. And many of those states do not exempt I&I products. So just because you don't sell a commercial retail product, that does not mean that you are exempted from these curbside recycling issues. It's something that we are definitely trying to push for. We try to make the case that I&I products are very different than a consumer product in terms of the waste, the type of packaging, all of these sort of things. So that's something that we're definitely tracking. As I mentioned earlier this year, Misha Raglan was hired as our regulatory affairs manager. We're going to be doing a lot on this issue, and I highly encourage you, if you have follow-up questions about that or what's going on at the federal level with EPA and chemical regulations. So please reach out, introduce yourself to her. She's still trying to get to know a lot of our members, but that would be a good person. Have a conversation with her, talk about your business. That's going to be something that's definitely very impactful moving forward. Very quickly, our Healthy Workplaces Coalition. This is something that ISSA started with the International Well Building Institute back in 2022. Actually came out of COVID when we were pushing for tax credit for cleaning and healthy buildings. We now have more than 60 groups that are part of that, talking about everything from the cleaning, the design of a building, the air filtration, indoor air quality. We actually just had a meeting of that coalition earlier this week. And I think I saw in the chat conversations about um, getting people back to the office. And that was a huge aspect of what we've been talking about this coalition. One is obviously we want to make sure that if there ever is another emerging pathogen or pandemic, that 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 we are ready and basically able to help the administration or any sort of lawmakers navigate that and understand the best practices when it comes to healthy workplaces, trying to help incentivize that, trying to find any ways to incentivize businesses to invest in their buildings. And one aspect of that is the Trump administration, at least through some of his advisors, have said they're going to call for all federal employees to come back to the office. This was something that the Biden talked about, but never actually really imposed. So I think you're going to see that. Two reasons. One, I think they see that there's value in bringing people back to the office. The other aspect is I think they're trying to cut some employees as well, and I think that's one way that they see low hanging fruit of being able to cut some of the costs that are already out there. So I do see that as being something. You're seeing more and more of the private sector return to the office, and obviously from a cleaning perspective, that does help many of our members who clean building space. What we've been trying to say and what we've really pushed at is saying, hey, um, if you're going to bring people to the office, make sure that's a healthy and safe work building environment. And that's where this coalition, which is a broad spectrum of the cleaning industry, but also building owners, restaurant association, trying to say, hey, how can we help these businesses do the right thing and invest in these clean buildings? So that's something that we're really pushing forward to. End period poverty. So this is something that we launched in, I think, also 2022. We advocate to put menstrual care products in away from home bathrooms. We believe they should be as available as soap, paper towel, and toilet paper. So currently we have 20 states now. This is an increase of about, I think, 8 or 9 over the last couple of years, as well as 30 states have repealed what's called the tampon tax. South Carolina being the most recent. It is a hugely bipartisan bill. Utah is one state that has universal access in schools to period products. And then you have states like South Carolina and Texas that have repealed the tax on tampons and pads. So we actually won an award for this from the Association of Associations earlier this year for this government for this advocacy campaign. Something we'll continue to roll out at both the federal and the state level. So something to kind of point to. And the last issue I want to talk about is this is under the kind of the idea of workforce development. Um, we have been supporters of the Freedom to Invest in Tomorrow's Workforce Act. I know Jeff mentioned the worker opportunity tax credits. That's something we're definitely supportive of as well. Any ability to incentivize training of workers, especially frontline training, is huge for the industry. We feel like there's a huge lack of investment. You know, there's so much investment at the traditional 4-year college level and not enough for those who actually do sort of, work out there, whether that's needing a certificate, pursuing alternative career paths, mid-year career changes. So the Freedom to Invest in Tomorrow's Workforce Act is one of the big issues that we will actually be talking about and trying to push for as part of the overarching tax debate. So what this would do effectively is expand 529 savings plans to include non-traditional sort of education. So credentialing, licenses, non-governmental certifications like the ones ISSA or others offer to basically incentivize that. This is also hugely bipartisan. So 26 Senate co-sponsors last session, half and half Republican Democrat, and almost a third of the House has also co-sponsored it. Once again, very bipartisan. So we're very optimistic that we'll be able to push this over the finish line in next year. With that, I know I went over a lot very quickly, but there's a lot going on. These are kind of just high level, some of the priorities and some of the big issues that ISSA see impacting some of our members, and that we'll be kind of proactively pushing for. So I do have some questions, but so if you do have any questions, please put those in the Q&A box. I see that we do have a couple, but while we're getting some more questions, I did want to give just kind of quickly 3 ways you can get involved. One, sign up for our alerts. You don't automatically get them for being an ISSA member. So if you don't already, you can go to our Action Center, sign up for those. We are getting close to celebrating International Cleaning Week. As I mentioned, we had 24 governors last year proclaim, as well as the House of Representatives. We'd love to get more governors. If you're interested, it takes like 2 seconds. Stacy will even submit the form for you. It's really cool. You get a printed out signed by the governor saying, cleaning week in New Jersey or Georgia. So reach out to Stacy. She can help you with that. And then also, if you really want to get involved, if maybe you've done some work in the past in your own state at the local level, reach out to Stacy. You can become a state advocacy leader. That's a brand new program. It's a great way. Not a huge time. We meet quarterly. We send out updates monthly. Just another way of getting involved on various issues. And then lastly, one more plug for our fly-in. It's something that we're really excited about and something that we're going to be pushing for more people next year. I don't know if Jeff knows this, but IFA is actually a supporting organization for that. So we're hoping to have some franchises there. We also have a lot of other groups like BSCAI, into the nonwoven fabrics, and IICRC, which is the restoration cleaners. So it's a huge kind of confab of all cleaning, right? So we're really excited about that. So if you can make it, that would be great. So going in to some of our questions, I saw the one comment about kind of people coming back to the work office. I think I already acknowledged that as part of my conversation, but I do see that being something that they do pretty early on in the legislature when Trump takes office. Sorry, it's some people are putting them in the chat, so it's a little trickier to find. So there is one question. I'll have to get back to you. UG has a question about the list of states that have exemption for tampons and pads. I can get that to you afterwards. I'm sure we have your email, but it's about 30 of them that don't tax tampons or pads. So it's a pretty lengthy list, but we'll get to it. There was one question, and I don't know who it was from, Jeff, but I think it was based on one of your things. Um, there was I guess on one of your slides you said misguided state-based policies. What
Yeah.
did you kind of mean for that? I'm assuming that's some sort of catch-all, but can
Yeah.
you kind of maybe flesh that out a little bit?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I mean, we're focused there on a couple things. One, are these workplace boards that we've seen, labor standards boards at either the state level in California or local levels in places, like I said, Minneapolis, or we've seen some of them proposed in places like New York or Montgomery County, Maryland. So ensuring that we do everything we can to prevent that type of and that also wraps into sector an issue that's called sectoral bargaining, which is a problem for us and could be for others too, is for those of you really into labor law, which hopefully isn't a lot of you, but at least from a in the weeds perspective, I should say, is sectoral bargaining something that's more commonplace in Western Europe, and the notion that an entire sector, all of fast food kind of creates this one union. Anyway, so that all kind of ties into just preventing that type of stuff from permeating up, if you will, into Washington. You hear oftentimes that the states are sometimes, or I should often refer to as the laboratories of democracy, right? So you hear that, a lot of these policies may go for its first test run or test drive in a state before that state senator all of a sudden becomes U.S. Senator so and so, and he or she brings that idea to Washington, right? So we're just doing what we can to ensure, and we do that through a number of ways. Obviously, shoe leather lobbying, going out and doing the talking and the meetings. We also obviously have a road show, are open for opportunity where we go across the country and visit, bring franchisees and kind of do all these events that bring folks together. But essentially, what we're trying to do is just prevent a misunderstanding of what the franchise model is, which can lead to misguided policies, which can ultimately make their way here and then impact everybody.
I would just piggyback that a little bit. The sort of laboratories of democracy. I also used to work in state level policy quite a bit, and it's kind of a blessing and a curse, right? You have these things where it's a great way to test it out. It's a lot easier to get some of these legislations passed at the state level, and they are kind of training grounds, right? If it works, they do try to carry them up to the federal level, or if not the federal level, to other states, right? And then you have half the states are doing one thing, the states are doing other things. So that's one thing. I always hear from some of our members who are like, well, I'm in X state, Ruby Red, Texas. So I don't really care what's going on in Texas, or I don't care what's going on in California. But a lot of those policies do get exported. So it's one reason why you really need to be vigilant at the state level. We try to engage on it, but it's always good to see you guys get engaged as well. And there was a question in here from Amanda about Minnesota and their broad cleaning products PFAS bans, specifically related to floor coatings. So it was essentially asking if we lobbied on that. So the PFAS issue is very, very tricky. We track it, we engage on it. A lot of the policy, and I think there's just a lot more nuance to a lot of these issues, even the labor issues that Jeff was talking about. It's not like a we oppose or we support always. It's really kind of getting into the nitty gritty. Like the questions we have about a PFAS bill is how are they tracking it? How are they going to test it? What are they defining as PFAS, which can be different from Minnesota to the EPA. So there's a lot of room for, I guess, debate and conversation. And that's a lot of what we do, I would say, on a daily basis, whether it's on a chemical regulation like Minnesota's PFAS or on any sort of issue, right? In California, when they were talking about the work loading limits, they were saying that was to protect worker safety. We're supportive of worker safety. We don't want any frontline janitorial workers of getting hurt. We just felt like the way that they were going about it was not actually going to prevent any injuries on the workplace. So it's like I said, sometimes I think we live in this sort of news bite sort of, you have got to be able to answer it yes or no in 30 seconds. And sometimes it's a lot more nuanced than that. So just kind of a FYI in terms of that. Jeff, in terms of what you guys are seeing, in terms of I know there was the Department of Labor. It looks like, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm kind of putting you on the spot. So uh, Trump has basically promoted or said that he was going to for Department of Labor, the director, someone who's very friendly to organized labor,
Mm.
Republican. kind of a mixed bag in terms of labor issues. We're also, I'll just say this, I say we're not anti-union. We work with unions. We have unionized and non-unionized shop, but there are some issues there. Right? Has IFA been looking into that? And what do you see in terms of like broad picture labor issues?
Yeah. Yes, we have. You're talking about Chavez Reamer, who's potentially the incoming labor secretary. Obviously, she's a Republican. She does have some concerning kind of stops, if you will, in her past from our perspective, namely is her co-sponsorship of the PRO Act here in DC a few years ago, which certainly was caught our attention. Now, the PRO Act for us is a hodgepodge of, and we are also, I should preface this, we are not anti-organized labor. We just happen to butt heads a lot on issues. So I'm sure there are a lot of nice people over there, and it just so happens they like to push legislation that we don't usually like. So with that aside, and the PRO Act here in DC is again a federal bill that had a laundry list of I don't remember how many, 20 plus provisions that were all sorts of different kind of a goodie bag, if you will, for organized labor. And again, that's not inherently bad, but there were a number of them in there that are challenging for us. DeReamer was obviously, Chavez DeReamer was a co-sponsor of that legislation at one point in time, which in and of itself gave us pause in terms of what her positions may be on some of our issues coming in. From a labor perspective, it's hard to know, right? Again, I mean, I think that this whole administration is a wild card. It's hard to know, right? We're not as fearful. I should say we're certainly not as fearful as we were, this time 4 years ago. That the regulatory kind of aggressiveness that we expected to see and we have seen from things like NLRB, DOL. For us, FTC is typically can be a challenge for us. We haven't, we think that those regulatory issues will get better from a DOL perspective specifically. The big ones, IC rules, overtime rules, and independent contractor rules, overtime rules, and certainly joint employer issues. I mean, all of those big picture wise, we anticipate getting better as opposed to getting worse for us in the next 4 years. But how long they get better and what are the details as to how we get there is still a little bit of a TBD. But given that we're coming into a Trump 2.0, even for his lack of predictability, which I've mentioned a few times, at least we've seen 4 years, right? So you have a sense of maybe some of the visions for departments of labor that he wants to put forward. We think that it's a little bit of wait and see. We're trying to lay the groundwork with folks at DOL or folks that we think are going to be in DOL before they get there. Obviously, like I'm sure everybody around town is doing. But I think it will all kind of wrap into this. I mean, to us, like you look at the notion of DOGE and like this rolling back of the federal government, right? That will probably permeate into all sorts of different things, and so ultimately, expecting less regulations as opposed to more, which I know is kind of an easy answer to give, but on December 11th, at least staring down the holidays and a new administration, we think it's looking brighter as opposed to dimmer, which is different than where we were 4.5 years ago.
Yeah, and just along those lines, I was just reading through the chat, make sure I didn't miss anything. There was some conversation, and I'll follow up with some of the people. There's some talk about paid sick leave. I did do a presentation about some of the changes at the various state levels. Like Jeff and IFA, we don't really take a position on a lot of those sort of minimum wage issues. We kind of track them and ensure that you guys know what's kind of going on. But we have some really good guidance about that. Other things like sales tax on services, which I know has been kind of a hot commodity at the state level as well. So, like I said, if you sign up for some of our alerts, you're able to get some of those updates. But with that, I think that's all the time we have today, unfortunately. Really appreciate, Jeff, your time. Anything else you want to plug while you're here, or where they can find out more information?
No, I mean, franchise.org is our website. Obviously, if you have questions about who we are, what we do, if you're a cleaning company in the franchise space and you're not a member, feel free to send me an email. We'd love to have you. But no, I appreciate ISSA's partnership. We, like John said, we've worked together on a lot of issues and will continue to do so. And would again encourage you all to come to DC for your advocacy summit. It is hugely helpful to everything, all the work that associations do in and around Washington and in the states. Because, like I said, hearing from directly from business owners, employers, and constituents, most importantly, is really helpful in moving the needles with elected officials. So I make the same pleas to IFA members, and I'll just echo John's that you really get a lot out of it. You get to meet some great folks, and you get to walk around the Capitol. It's a great experience. I would encourage you to take advantage of it.
Yeah, really appreciate Jeff and IFA for all they've done. Really thank all of you, obviously, for taking some time. I know it's a busy time of year, vacations and such, and trying to get some rest before the beginning of the new year. But really appreciate everyone joining us. And please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Stacy, or Misha on my team if we can be of any help. If you have any other follow-up questions, we are your advocacy team. So let us know how we can be of help on anything that's facing you. So with that, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your week.